Welcome to the Primary Sources podcast from Viral History. My name is Joanne Paul, and I am here to chat with some of the world's leading historians. Not just about what they do, the past worlds they bring to life, but how they do it, and for goodness sake, why they do it. I'm interested in motivations and approaches, and how they came to find themselves buried in the past in the first place. Today, I am very excited to welcome Dr. Emma Wells to the podcast. Emma is a medievalist and Reformation-era specialist working on the late medieval and Reformation English parish church and cathedral, pilgrimage, the cult of saints, and the senses, as well as built heritage more generally. She's currently lecturer in ecclesiastic and architectural history and has a book on Pilgrim Roots of the British Isles, which came out in 2016, and a forthcoming book called Heaven on Earth, coming out in May 2022. She also has a very active social media following, and just this past month launched her very own historical clothing brand called What is History? Emma, how are you, and how are you doing all of this?
Hello, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Little sleep, but plenty of ideas, I suppose. So that's why, that's how.
When was the last time I saw you? It's been, I want to say there was a book launch.
Dan Jones and Marina's book launch, I think.
That's what I thought it was, Color of Time. Yeah, it's been absolutely ages.
It has been a pandemic, so.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll have to find time to see each other in person, but it's lovely to see you, at least on the screen, and hear you as well. Let's start where I always like to start, at the beginning. Terribly original place to begin. Where, when, and how did you catch the history bug?
Well, I suppose it goes back right to my childhood. And my beloved grandmother, who's now passed, but she used to take me around North Yorkshire and, lug me around to all the monasteries, the castles, the churches, sort of every week, before I even started school. And I suppose it was just ingrained within me from that very early age, and I was captivated by, the monuments and these sort of monumental behemoth buildings that were just, to a very tiny person. I still am a very tiny person, but to a very tiny person at that age, they were just awe-inspiring, overwhelming. And then I was lucky enough to I think we were one of the sort of handful of sixth forms who were able to do Tudor history at A-level. So yes, I was very spoilt. So it's either Tudor history then or modern history, as, I suppose the war is cast us back then. And we were introduced to Henry VII, and we were looking at sources for the first time. And then from there I went a sort of roundabout way. I was supposed to do theology at Durham, so if anyone is thinking, going a different way, things do happen, and sometimes for the best. So I was going to do theology at Durham, decided perhaps it wasn't the right avenue, and did my first degree in history of art. So it was then I came back to the medieval buildings, to the castles, to the churches, and through my module choices, I decided this was for me, and particularly medieval architecture in general.
It's the monumental, as you say, nature of these buildings. I mean, some of them are absolutely, it's unfathomable how they built them. That's why, books like Pillars of the Earth are so popular, because they go into the sort of the stories behind them and the generations it takes to build them. But there's something about buildings too, isn't there, that you enter the past. When Helen Carr was on, we were talking about just this moment where you go into a building. Was that part of it for you as well?
Yeah, particularly for me, I like to understand and experience the past through the built environment. I mean, we just have to think about the fact that pretty much everything that occurred within history occurred within four walls, whether they were masonry walls or, I don't know, hawthorn bushes or whatever within a field. But everything has occurred within some sort of environment, whether it's built, whether it's pastoral, whatever it might be. And so our buildings particularly are they are the sources, they are primary sources in and of themselves, therefore will speak. And I think particularly, I went to buildings archaeology rather than straight history. And as a result, got to experience and approach buildings through a variety of different approaches rather than just let's look at the documentary sources. And through looking at a combination of, the architecture, why is that wall built that way? How has it developed over time? Why is that stained glass, the composition of that stained glass like that? Why the images like that? In addition to everything that was going on within the space, I find that absolutely fascinating. And that's why we can understand the past so well through built architecture.
Thank you for saying buildings are primary sources. That's, of course, you managed to get the title in there. I appreciate that. And that's a question I wanted to ask you. How do we read a building as a primary source? Is it the building itself? You talked about the documentary evidence itself. I mean, how do we engage with architecture as a source for history?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because I suppose there's a variety of different approaches we can take, and I think this is why my career, I went from art history to buildings archaeology and then ended up in a history department, because I suppose, what do I call myself? An architectural historian / buildings archaeologist? I don't know. I don't even know. An interdisciplinarian. But the way we use scholars such as myself, academics who look at the built environment, tend to look at them is, I myself will look at the physical development, the physical composition, how it's built, why it's built in that way, the imagery, the furnishings, the furniture. I'd like to look at everything, particularly if I'm looking, for example, at the approach I take, which is sensory experience, the senses. And then you go to, or you might go one way or the other, then you'll go to the primary sources and how do they support the way that building was built, or why it was built that way, or how it developed over time. And then you might from then look at how it was experienced and understood and the space was physically used. So for me, the architecture is the primary source. And from there, I usually go back to use the historical documents. Sometimes, obviously, it does go both ways. As I say, you might find a great primary source, in a manuscript, something that says this building was built here or this was developed here. And then you think, okay, well, how does the actual fabric of the building show us this and illustrate this? But it's extremely multidisciplinary. And I think that's really important. And coming as a buildings archaeologist or whatever we're going to call me, I think sometimes when we're talking to historians, we find it odd that they don't look at the buildings. So it's just sort of second nature to me.
I think you're right about sometimes not thinking about this built context for historical events. Because when I went from writing academic histories to starting to think about narrative histories, that was one of the switches that had to happen. That all of a sudden I talk about it furnishing the room, furnishing the scene with literal furniture, and with the building, and understanding how that historical event not only takes place in a particular context, but is shaped by that context. And I think sometimes, I'm a historian of ideas, so they tend to exist in a sort of abstraction, but actually we need to be paying attention to that relationship between the events and the people and the built context in which that is all taking place.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because if you think, when I look at my work on the Reformation parish church, for example, and you look at how the hierarchy of space changed during that era, you go from a very defined hierarchy of space getting more and more significant, more and more sacred as you go towards the east in a church, in very simple terms. And in some respects, that's sort of wiped out a little bit, or sort of opened up, if you will, very distinctive spaces for the laity, for the general, congregation, and then for the clergy. And then it sort of gets a little bit, and they're sort of looking after the building, those parts of the buildings. Things get changed, and we go from public spaces to private spaces when we look at devotion. So we're actually seeing how history plays out within architecture and how it changes. And, we get rid of the idols, we get rid of stained glass, we get rid of screens. And so we're seeing it physically in the fabric itself and these changes over time. So I think it's really important to actually look at the environment that history occurs.
We talked a little bit about the idea of entering a space, a historical building, and the effect that I think that has on most of us, probably most people listening to this podcast anyway, who are interested in history. You've worked a bit on the senses, and obviously there are all sorts of ways in which we experience a building, especially I think a church where there's all sorts of attention paid to sounds, acoustics, and smell. Even probably not taste. You'll tell me if I'm wrong, but certainly sight. Oh, really? Taste as well. Okay. When we experience a building, a historic building today, with all of our senses, touch as well, certainly. Is that the same way that they experienced it in the past? In other words, are our senses historically contingent, or are our senses within a historical building what is able to connect us to the past?
Well, it's a really interesting concept, because the way that we experience the senses or sense today is actually different to the medieval senses, for example. The sort of westernized, more modern concept of the five senses didn't really exist in the medieval era. And it was far more of a hybrid of senses or synesthetic. And although today we think of synesthesia as sort of writing with colour or seeing colour, that sort of thing, then it was far more about senses combining as one, if you will. So we do sense, I suppose, in the same way. I suppose we're still human beings. We still sense in the same way, but the sensory experience that one is receiving, if we're going into a church today, is obviously very, very different to how one would have received and sensed a medieval parish church or a medieval cathedral. You had a sort of accumulation of different senses occurring at the same time in order to affect you theologically, spiritually, philosophically, and everything else, at the same time as also the architecture and the art of the space being combined and sort of accumulated within that one experience. So everything, for example, within the church, and particularly if we're thinking of pilgrimage and the experience of, walking into a church as a pilgrim and going towards a shrine, even the architecture was specifically designed with sensory elements in mind to impact the pilgrim as a sort of memory element, if you will. And so will we ever receive that again? Perhaps we can at the likes of Walsingham or Lourdes, or perhaps in some respects, but it's a different sensory experience, very different.
So it's not so much that the senses change or are contingent in that sense, but our interpretation and engagement with them and understanding of them is changed.
Yeah, and all the sort of external factors that are going on as well. And we are not medieval Christians, for example, walking into a church. So fundamentally, we're going to have a completely different sensory experience, and our churches look completely different in the main than they did in the 14th century, for example.
Okay, so I have to ask, how do you taste a church?
Well, lick one. But actually, licking was a prime example. It was a prime part, should I say, of pilgrimage, of devotion towards the cult of saints. So the closer one was to a relic, the more efficient the receival of sanctity, the receipt of sanctity, should I say. So that's why we have these great shrines where you can physically crawl into them. You have the portholes got openings in these shrines, and that was as much a part. So it's touch, it's feel, smells as well. You have all the sensing going around, and then you would also kiss and lick relics, to get as close as you could to that saint or that holy person. So
yeah, that's true. Actually, I am aware of the kissing the forehead, wasn't it, or things like that, or the feet, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was more of a sort of devotional experience, true, but you would also we have the water of Becket, etc., and you would scrape off part of bones and shrines, etc., mix them with holy water or the blood of Thomas Becket, and even ingest these concoctions as well. So again, to receive the sanctity, and hopefully a miracle will occur, or you'll have a cure for your gammy leg or whatever it might be. So there was a much more tangible, I think, experience than perhaps. I think religion is still the same today. Some of these relics that are an old finger of a certain saint, they're still paraded around today within the Catholic, within the Catholic world, and people are still experiencing in this same sensory way.
Speaking of pilgrims, your first book, you like that segue?
Yeah.
Speaking of, your first book was Pilgrim Roots of the British Isles. This is a fantastically gorgeous book, as well as, of course, being well researched and frankly, really useful. It describes 7 pilgrim routes which you can walk today with histories as well as maps. It's part a work of history, part travel guidebook. What inspired this book as a way of reaching out to a wider public with your research?
Well, it's sort of evolved from some research I was doing on Lindisfarne and the idea of medieval pilgrimage or late medieval pilgrimage to the original burial site of St. Cuthbert and the the monastic cells he lived on as a hermit, essentially, in his later life. And I was fascinated by the primary sources we still have of, the boats being used for pilgrims coming, as pilgrims in the 14th century, which is several hundred years after he died. And I thought, this is interesting. And we have his cell, which seems to be, again, later medieval. They've recreated his, where he actually lived. This isn't, the original. So it was from that, and I thought, oh, maybe I should look into St. Cuthbert's Way, which was, very fascinating pilgrim route, which is in the book, and look at the historical origins. And the more I did this, the more my research got out of hand. And I thought, this doesn't make any sense because, this wasn't really here. And yes, there was a dedicated church here, but that wasn't until far later. So how have we come up with these pilgrim routes? And the more that I looked into it, the more I realized that the majority of our pilgrim routes are later recreations. They might be original Drover's Way, or this sort of safest route that travellers have used over millennia, really. And then they've later been integrated with places of tourism, places, yes, associated with the saint, but also integrated with, more infamous or famous places of tourism, depending on where we are. And that they were, as I say, a modern construction. And I wanted to look, therefore, at what are the historically accurate, I suppose, sites associated with these routes, but also what about the other places that have been integrated? And let's look at the history of those and why they've been integrated. And that's how the book was sort of born, really.
Have you done all of the walks that are in it?
Over time, I've done bits and bobs of all, pretty much all of them. Yeah, I mean, they're not easy, and I've certainly not done them as a straight pilgrim from A to B. But I have looked at it. Some of the most beautiful walks, though, I will say that if anyone wants to get the book, if they're just a walker, these are some of the greatest walks that you can take in the British Isles.
Do you have a favorite of the 7?
St. Cuthbert's Way, I think. It's because
where is that?
It straddles the borders, so between England and Scotland, and you end up in one of the holiest place on earth, or one of the most holiest places on earth, most spiritual places, which is Holy Island or Lindisfarne. And it's a tidal island, so you can, once you're on, you can't get off at certain points. You have to check the tide times, or you'll get stranded. But it's a beautiful, beautiful island. If you go in the sort of winter months, you don't get, it's not a great tourist trap in the winter months, and you have the castle there, which was a Tudor castle, really. And then the gardens were designed by the original editor and creator of Country Life magazine. So you have that, and then you have the monasteries and where Cuthbert lives. So it's a place to walk in the footsteps of pilgrims past, but also St. Cuthbert himself, and I don't think there's anywhere like it. So do that one.
And I believe there is a video on Viral History of you talking about St. Cuthbert's Way, and I think my co-producer Paul dresses up like a pilgrim, and you. Yep. So if listeners have not seen that video, I highly recommend it.
There's a whole series of St. Cuthbert's Way that we did, which is a great sort of introduction to the route, and I think that was harder to do and film than actually walking the way itself, because you have to get a car to these very remote places. But yeah, it really does show the beauty of this route and the spirituality behind it. Yeah.
Most of us, I think, do tend to visit historic sites, churches, castles, by car or by train or some other form of modern transport. Is there something a bit more speaking of sensing and encountering a building authentically, historically, is there something a bit more authentic about walking to these buildings and experiencing them in this way?
Yeah, I think there is. It's a truly evocative experience, and I think the arduous, which is all part and parcel of being a pilgrim, is taking an arduous, laborious, stressful, strenuous journey, is part and parcel of the creation and the development, the evolution of a spiritual experience that you then receive when you enter the church as a pilgrim. So I think it's the same with anything. If you're walking a treacherous journey and you get to your destination, you are sort of, oh, thank goodness, So there's a special connection with that. And I think it's Winston Churchill who says, we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us. And I think pilgrimage is truly the definition of this. Once you get into that church or that cathedral and experience just how medieval pilgrims would have felt, and spiritually connected to the saint or to the Holy Family or whoever you're visiting. Yeah, I think there's nothing like it, really. Yeah.
You and I have spoken a bit in the past about the great need to preserve historical buildings right now, and you've done a lot of work to this end. Can you talk us through a little of the work you've done and the institutions and groups that you've worked with, and share why you think it is so crucial that we save these buildings at risk?
Yeah, I mean, as we've spoken about, history is usually contained within the four walls of our built environment. Buildings speak, buildings matter. They are expressive. They say something about our people and our people's past. They are not just architecture. So I've worked with quite a few, and sort of prior to becoming, I suppose, a full-time academic, I was an historic buildings consultant and heritage consultant. So was looking at it from a very different angle, which was working with whether it's companies or the public to conserve, preserve their buildings. So when you're looking at this from that angle, rather than just let's research the building, what do we need to preserve and why are we doing it for the general public? When it's a home, it's a very different sort of, you have to approach things very differently, I suppose. And what is significant is the most significant part. I mean, yes, we still interpret buildings in that way as planning consultants or as planning scholars, but you have to look at why should we keep this, why, and how buildings develop and evolve over time. I mean, yes, we still have our monumental palaces or our castles or our monasteries, but they are serving a purpose for the modern day. So do we keep something in ruins, or do we, I don't know, create a big glass box next to it to, I don't know, for a tea room or something? And it's really understanding, and this is what I teach my students on the MA in English Building History, is yes, you might want to rip out those PVC windows, but you're going to have to put in sash windows. And what era do you put them from? If it's an 18th century building, do you then put in a Victorian sash, or then do you put in an 18th century sliding sash? And it's always, my students always want to get back to the original, but is that the most significant aspect of that building? So we need to look at why the building was used, who lived in it, and how the space evolved over time. So I've gone the other end, which is the ecclesiastical side, and worked on diocesan advisory committees. And again, that's so interesting because it's completely different from the secular planning committees and the planning sectors, because there's ecclesiastical exemption. So you have a sort of team of experts dealing with how churches change, whether they should have toilets in their tower, whether they should get rid of this monument or whatever. But you're still doing the same work. So I've worked with them. I'm a patron of a chapel in Suffolk as well. So again, a chapel that's still being used, Methodist chapel. And I've worked for SPAB as well, Society Protection of Ancient Buildings. So I've looked at it from all different angles. And I think that's really important, because we can be quite narrow in the way we look at buildings and things. That's an historic building. It needs to be retained. And I don't believe I will say this, but I will say that's not always the case. Just because something is historic doesn't mean it should always be retained or preserved. You need to look at the significance of something. I'm not saying we should get rid of our historic buildings by any means, but there just needs to be a very in-depth, very sort of thought-out approach to understanding significance.
Could you give us an example of a historic building that you think has been preserved or restored or presented to the public in some way that you think is a good exemplar of sort of best practice?
Gosh, let me think. Well, I suppose you can look at a lot of our great cathedrals, really. I can think, for example, of Winchester Cathedral. It has, the reason being is, from the outside, you would think this is a great medieval cathedral. When you walk inside, you'll see that you have the crypt, for example, which floods all the time. And instead of just thinking, oh gosh, we have a crypt that floods, they've turned it into an art exhibition with Anthony Gormley statues in there. And so when it does flood, it creates this beautifully evocative and spiritual space. And then within there as well, they have the Winchester Bible exhibition. So particular exhibition spaces which have been sort of sectioned off using glass, but they're very sympathetic to the fabric. And then at the same time, as you go more and more east, and you have the shrine up there, it's, and a lot of the chantry chapel, sort of original chapels all around, they're still screened off. So you still get that sort of very spiritual, evocative, intimate and personal and private devotional experience still. So I think that's a really good way of doing things. They've done the same actually at York Minster, and they have an exhibition below and some of William's tomb in there. So I think Westminster, I can go on and on actually. I think the Church of England has done really well with this, and our churches are really striving. I actually went to Ludlow recently, and the church there it was the first time I'd been in a church that was a real working church, and we were greeted by a television screen with the vicar talking to us about what you can experience and see within the church. And there's the gift shop as you go in, which is all screened off, and then you have the play corner, and then you have very fancy toilets, I must admit. But it was much a church for, you can experience this, but it's also here for worship, but we need to bring in money. So I think those are wonderful examples.
What do you see as some of the most significant threats to historical buildings, let's say within the British Isles right now?
The government, perhaps.
Yeah.
I think the issue is we need more housing. For example, we do. There is a lack of housing, but rather than just building new houses, why are we not looking at the great reserve of historic buildings that we still have? That some of which are just being left. You know, these historic buildings are not just ruins. They are not there just to be left. They are part of history, and they are usually very sturdy and sound spaces which should be restored or conserved and used. And I think we tend to forget about that. I've seen it around me where I live, just building. It's so cheap to build new houses. And that seems to be the problem, is as a result, planning laws are too easy to change. And in addition, what I found, particularly when I was a heritage consultant, was there isn't the money invested into conservation, into local authorities. And unfortunately, it's your local authority that deals with listed buildings, with all that side of things. And you won't have, a conservation officer will leave and there's no one put in place. So things are getting through the gap, and we need a far more rigid planning system with experts that know how to deal with historic buildings. And I don't see any other way, apart from obviously greater funding. I mean, we've seen what's going on at Stonehenge. The need for evolution, of course, we're not denying the need for evolution, the need that, roads need to be built better. And it's unfortunate a road ended up next to Stonehenge. But that doesn't mean that we need to decimate, millennia of our archaeology as a result. There are ways.
Well, I think Stonehenge is a good example, because I think we both worked a little bit on that campaign, where questions around climate change also come into it. Yeah. And Stonehenge was an example where, the need for more and bigger and better roads for cars was threatening this spectacular historical monuments. And we've spoken a little bit in the past about how the desire to preserve, restore, and, as you say, use historic buildings does at times, well, it fits with the climate agenda. And of course, the climate crisis does threaten these buildings in all sorts of ways. Can you say a little bit about that as a way of thinking about preserving historic sites as well?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it all has to go part and parcel together. Is climate change is as much of it's all the same issue, I suppose, and we can't separate. So, yes, we need to be focused on climate change. But we need sustainability as well, and we need evolution. So, how do we put it all together? I don't know the answer. I'll be honest, I don't know the answer. But I think the way to start is really going back to sort of grassroots level and looking at why we are preserving and conserving these great monuments or, a historic house down the road, and why they're important, how they can be used, but also how we can evolve space in relation to climate threats, but also sustainability for the future. And I think the problem is the two are often not connected in any way, or they're not seen as that they should be connected. And that's the only way to do it. And we all need to come together to look at these wider threats so that the government therefore invests again in our planning system, because and fundamentally that's what they are at the heart of this, and they make the decisions.
What can people do to help?
You tell me. Buy a historic home. I think there needs to be. I think education actually is another thing that's really important, because I think there is a fundamental lack of understanding to do with history, with how our history is used, with how our history is retained and preserved, conserved, sustainable, how it can be sustainable. And I think people think new is good and bad is old. And, if you put things, for example, on social media and you say this great historic home is up for sale for so-and-so, you will always get people say, yes, but it'll have damp. Yes, but it'll take all this money. And you think, do you think that's not going to be the case for a modern home in 10 years? It's still going to be the same. These are sound buildings that were built with, great architects and great materials. That doesn't mean we should completely get rid of them. We need a better understanding, as I say, of historic buildings, how fabric can be used, how they can be preserved, and there needs to be an ease. There is a real disconnect between, for example, if you own a listed building and how you deal with it. People think, I don't want a listed building, I can't do anything with it. That's not the case whatsoever. Absolutely not whatsoever. And therefore, I think there needs to be sort of working with the public at how we understand historic buildings, and if you want to purchase one, what you can actually do, and that you are custodian for this building and you're going to save it for the future. And that's important.
I want to talk about the forthcoming book, which I'm very excited about. Heaven on Earth, The Lives and Legacies of the World's Greatest Cathedrals. And it's coming out, is it May of next year?
12th of May, 2022.
12th of May, we know specifically. Oh, I will put that in my diary. This is a monumental, pun intended, undertaking, which covers 1,000 years of cathedral building from 500 to the 16th century. And it also has a global scope, is that right?
It does to a point. It is called the World's Greatest Cathedrals, and I know I'm going to spend my time saying this next year, but I am looking at, I think the greatest expression of our cathedrals is the Gothic style. The Gothic style was really when these buildings were at their peak, for several different reasons, which you need to read the book why. But as a result, I'm focused on I suppose Christendom. Western Christendom is the easiest way, although Russia is in there. We do look at the Hagia Sophia as well. So it is the world, but I'm not looking at, for example, America or Japan, although I do make references, of course, to elsewhere. But it is focused particularly on Western Christendom because it was at that time, particularly that sort of 1,000 years, I suppose, particularly up until the Reformation, in England at least, that these were structures built for consolation during contentious times, hope amid despair, for daily conduct, for religious, spiritual, and even aesthetic reasons. They were intertwined with sort of every single aspect of daily life. So that's why they're just so important. And when we think of cathedrals, we tend to think of the Gothic style. Yeah.
Did you have to, for this book, choose what you think are the greatest cathedrals? Is it like
Yes.
a list of how on earth did you do that?
Very difficult, with great difficulty, and I have put a sort of caveat in the introduction that says this is my personal choice, and I'm sure there will be great disappointment by many readers because I haven't included X, Y, or Z. But I had to make particular choices, and the reason that I've chosen the 20 that I have is because they all have very interesting tales, stories, people behind their construction, behind their development and evolution. So this is really the lives and legacies. It's not an architectural history by any means. It's not just a straight academic architectural history. It's more of a narrative history behind why these buildings were built, what was going on to build these buildings, what crises occurred, what was going on externally within, the monarchy, within Christendom at the time, and how did this affect and impact and therefore develop these great monumental buildings.
Was there a particularly fascinating find, a cathedral that you maybe hadn't spent that much time with that made it into the top 20?
Let me see. All of them. I think there were so many, actually. I think all of them. I knew probably most things about York. Although I didn't know about at the beginning, I didn't know about the 19th century fire where there was essentially an arson attack. And then the great sort of cult of carts, which it's an interesting discussion, but that essentially there was a coming together of people, from the laity, that helped to build Chartres as well as Saint-Denis. We saw it. And as a result, they end up depicted in the windows, arguably. Gosh, and I could go on, and William the Conqueror gets in there, and Salisbury is a really wonderful one as well. There's great rivalry between the original cathedral, Old Sarum, and therefore as a result they essentially say, I'm fed up with all this, I'm fed up with the castle, not treating us very well. They're sort of in the same place on Old Sarum on the hilltop, and as a result they move and build their own cathedral. But there's so much going on. There's the Magna Carta in there. There's, as I say, William the Conqueror. Everyone is going on. So you'll see how history is sort of interwoven within all these stories, I think.
Well, 12th of May, we'll look forward to it. Hopefully pre-ordering fairly soon.
It's
then.
out. It is out for pre-order
now.
now.
Really? For pre-order? See, I'm very behind the times. So it's out for pre-order now.
Yes.
Find your local independent bookshop and do see if you can pre-order Heaven on Earth. Both of your books, if I have it right, are really for wider public audiences. Yes. They are for people who don't necessarily have a background in history but want to find out more. And on this podcast, we've spoken to, just about everyone we've spoken to has that interest, I guess, in engaging with the public, and many of them balance academic jobs and research with their public engagement activities as well. Why for you is engaging with the public so important to what you do?
I think we, as academics, we can't stay in our ivory towers. What would be the point of making these wonderful research discoveries and not telling anyone about it in the simplest terms? Of course we can do that, and we do that at times. But we are making history. We are telling history, and we are changing history. And we need also to ensure that history evolves in different ways. We're looking at history from different approaches and therefore coming to different conclusions. And, there's that old adage of history is written by the victors. And we know that isn't entirely true. Of course it is in some respects, we can't deny that, but it's not really the case. And we need to rewrite history in order to tell it. And therefore, as someone who looks at buildings and understands history through buildings, it's really important to me to say, this stained glass window or this Gothic cathedral wasn't designed ad hoc. There were very specific reasons for it. And there are all these interesting tales, these interesting people, and you need to know about it. And I think you need to know about it as the general public. And if you didn't, and we didn't share this knowledge, you could walk into a building, you could walk into a cathedral particularly, and just walk past a wonderful depictions of monkeys holding urine flasks, as I did before I found out about it, and why they're there, and that they connect with us on a far more personal level. And I think, isn't that what history is about? We want to experience what life was like and why life was like it was, and things changed over time. And therefore, that's why I think it's really important to be writing for the general public as well as academia.
Why were the monkeys holding urine?
There's a great 14th century window in York Minster, North Nave Aisle. It's called the Pilgrimage Window, and there are monkeys, and there's Renyard the fox. There's loads of things going on in the marginalia, so the border, and they're sort of monkeying, aping the doctors of physics. So because Christ was the true doctor, and there's also the Virgin's funeral. A portrayal of it with the monkeys holding a bier, as in a coffin. So, there are these wonderful things, and there are absolutely vile but fascinating images depicted all over our church, which if you've heard my Naughty Churches talk or seen my work on it, you will know. So, you just wouldn't expect this, but it's important.
You were saying about ordinary people, finding themselves in history. And this is another theme that's come up quite a bit on the podcast, is the need for people who are engaging with history to be able to find themselves in it, especially people who have often been marginalized by history, women, the poor, people of color. I could go on. As someone who works on church history and buildings, is it quite easy to find those marginalized groups in the sort of history that you do? It's, to an outsider, it might seem, oh, that's, sort of very dry traditional history, but actually is all of that going on, and is all of that actually quite apparent in the primary sources, or do you have to dig a bit?
Well, actually, when I did my PhD, which was on the sensory experience of pilgrimage, of cathedrals and parish churches, I wanted to look at different audiences. So I looked at the royal experience of pilgrimage, I looked at the lay experience, etc., so on and so forth. And as a result, yes, there are primary sources, there are primary documents, there are accounts of pilgrims, but they tend to be more elite travellers, let's just say. So we do have that, but then when you put all the sources together, let's say, when you put the architecture with the primary accounts, etc., and you look at the sensory experience, you can get a sense of how a lay pilgrim would have walked in and understood and experienced that particular space. And when I was writing Heaven on Earth too, a lot of it, yes, I may start with, a momentous or historically significant event with, a certain king or a certain bishop, archbishop, or whatever. But I am then expanding on that narrative and saying, but this is how the population helped here. This is how the population helped or built this or contributed to this. And particularly, I want to do more research, and I'm hoping maybe next books, later books, will look at particularly women in the church, because I found that churches were also built by women, and I mean physically as well as in terms of economically. There was some great, yes, they contributed a lot of money, but also we do see women being sort of usually associates, if you will, on in building sites, but we do have accounts of women on the sort of ground and doing these jobs that we tend to think of as being very male-centric. But if they had a husband who had died, for example, they would take up their job. And I found that fascinating, and I thought there are women interwoven that their tales haven't been told particularly. And that they need to come to the fore, and then I need to explore this a little bit more. So their stories are there. We just need to unravel them.
I think it's fascinating too, by looking at the building as a primary source, as you do, we are able to see those marginalized lives present in a way that we might not in the document, because of course there are spaces in a church that are particularly for the elites, and for people with money and so on. But then there are spaces for people who don't have all of that, which means they must have been there. And we don't see them in the documents, but the space means that they occupied it, which means they were there, they were participating. But we only get that when we look at the building itself.
You wouldn't perhaps see anything in written records. You know, there'll be nothing on paper, parchment. There'll be nothing there. And, you know, we don't really get sort of church records as we, you know, births, marriages and deaths until after the Reformation, well, until the 16th century. So they are physically not there. But then we have, for example, graffiti, and we can see, you know, these great inscriptions of someone's life there as they were dying, unfortunately dying from the plague even. We can see people who were housed up in a church because of the plague and ended up losing their lives in that particular space. That is history written in walls, written in architectural fabric. So we can't deny that. If you had just looked at, you know, church records, you would say, oh, well, there was no women there, or there's no children. Actually, we can see it. They're there, or they may have contributed together as a guild or particular sort of associated group and paid for a certain window. And we can see that because we can see it in the choices that they made in the architecture, I mean. Yeah.
Amazing. All right, I think it's time for the quick fire.
Okay.
So series of questions, answer as quickly as you can, but obviously would love to hear your explanations. If you could resurrect one building that's lost to us, which would it be?
A building with not entirely gone, but I would love to see what it originally looked like in all of its glories, Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire. Just the magnitude of such a vast Cistercian abbey and all the sort of external buildings. Oh God, please, yes, please.
I'll get right on that for you.
Okay.
You can travel to see one building you've never seen in person tomorrow. Which one?
I'll tell you, no, actually, a building I actually haven't been to, which everyone probably thinks I have, is Roslin Chapel, which is in Scotland. So I know I'm terrible, but I actually have never been to Roslin Chapel. So I know it's not very far, but I will go. But yeah, Roslin Chapel.
What's particularly special about
just Google
that chapel?
Oh, I can't even tell you, but it's just the whole thing is symbolic. It's so important. Just Google. Please just Google, and you won't believe that it's a real chapel. I mean, it's just associated with the Templars, associated with what I think is associated with everything, but it inspires Da Vinci Code and all that sort of thing. So it is your typical medieval marvel, if you will. Yeah.
Okay. Shall we road trip it then?
Oh yes.
Yeah. We'll do that after term ends. Yeah. All right, we're going. What lesser known English religious building should we all make a pilgrimage to as soon as we can?
Oh gosh, you're putting me on the spot here.
That is the point of the quickfire. Yeah.
I know. This is so difficult. Long Melford Church, because it's such a fascinating church built by the wool industry, and it is sort of just wonderful. Just one of my favourites. Or any. Just go to your local church and really see it for what it is.
So I have to provide some context for this quickfire question because we didn't actually talk about it. But if I understand rightly, before you decided to take on the fast-paced and thrilling world of academic ecclesiastical history, you were a race car driver, which is obviously much more boring, and that's why you changed careers.
Absolutely.
Which pilgrim route, assuming no damage to any of the buildings, would make the best racing circuit?
I have no idea. I mean, some of them would be rather difficult because you might get stranded at sea.
That would make it harder. Yeah, although it would make it more exciting.
Wouldn't make it more
I would watch that.
I tell you what, actually, the Saints Way in Cornwall, because those roads are treacherous. So I have raced those roads, and you need a good driver to get around these tiny little country back roads with the huge hedges, and nothing's getting past you. So Saints Way in Cornwall.
So when we drive up to Scotland, you're driving. That's yes. I will provide the tunes.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, now for 3 questions, take a breath, that I ask each of our guests. And yes, you don't have to respond quick fire.
Okay.
This is what we've been calling our desert island docks question, but for you, it can be a building. What is your favorite primary source that you've worked on? AKA, what would you be stranded on a desert island with quite happily?
Again, very difficult question, but I would say, Canterbury Cathedral. I think I would just be there.
Classic.
Yeah, and then I'll go to the gift shop.
Gift shops are dangerous things.
I know.
Well, it says someone who's launched a clothing brand as well. So you've just leaned into it. What are you working on next?
What I'm working on next book, which I can hopefully will be revealed next month or so on, let's just say it's on relics.
Okay. The kind of relics you lick?
Yep. Oh yes. Oh yes. And all how they get to where it'll be very, very interesting. I can assure you.
Lickable Relics by Emma Wells,
yes.
Coming out 2020.
The Lick.
What advice would you give to a historian just starting out?
Do it if you love it. If history is what you truly love, be a historian. Which sounds simple advice, but I truly believe that. But I would also say, as an art historian / archaeologist / historian / whatever else, there are many different approaches that you can take to history. So explore those, because as we've seen today, primary sources are also architecture. So yeah, I'd say that.
I think that's a fantastic place to end. Thank you so much, Emma, for taking the time to speak with us and for sharing your approach to the study of the past.
Thank you ever so much for having me. Thank you.
Just a reminder, if you want to hear more conversations with history makers like Dr. Emma Wells, do subscribe to Primary Sources Podcast and follow us and Viral History on Instagram and Twitter, where you can also suggest future guests and send along quickfire questions to grill them with. Thanks for listening to Primary Sources.